Hi everybody, I'm Greg Fishel. Welcome to bonus weather video number 3 for this week. And this is something that I've talked about at least a couple of times since I've started doing this back in August of 2022. And it's the fact that I think it's ludicrous, to be honest with you, to talk about a normal high and normal low for a specific date. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with this, normals are basically a 30-year average, okay? And this is updated every 10 years. So right now we're using the period 1991 to 2020. And that will not change until we get to 2030 when we'll start using the period 2001 to 2030. So this is updated every 10 years. All the highs and lows are gathered at all these stations across the country. And the data is smoothed a little bit because if you didn't and you graphed it, there'd be a little jagged edges up and down because some days are just weird. You know, they don't always follow a normal, what we call a normal distribution. But for the most part, it does fit into a nice smooth curve. And so you can look at that data, and I would argue that since the weather is different every year, that it really isn't accurate to say this number is what it should be on this date. You know, no, the shoulds are within a range, not a specific number. So let's say in the instance we're going to use here, the 30-year average is 55, then you could say, okay, if it ends up between 47 and, let's see, 63, okay, that would be considered pretty much what you'd expect in this part of the country this time of year. And then if it's outside of that, then you can say that, okay, this may not be unprecedented, but it's certainly unusual. And then if you start getting down toward the all-time records, then you can talk about it being extremely unusual. But I just think it makes more sense. So I wanted to show you this in graphical form. And so this is an example using a mean or an average, and let me put myself in the corner so I don't block all the stuff. A mean of 55, and the coldest high temperature ever observed at the Raleigh-Durham Airport on February 2nd was 31, and the warmest ever observed was 79. And so basically the bell curve encompasses that range. And just because of a few statistical quirks, the bell curve actually extends out beyond that 31 and 79. That's why it sort of has that blocky look. And for those of you not familiar with this kind of a graph, think about a classroom that just took a whole bunch of tests. And most of the test scores end up being in the fat part of the bell here. You have the really smart students that are up here on the high end, and you have the not so smart students, or maybe it would be fair just to say some students that just don't test well, and they end up on the lower end of the bell, but most of them are clustered here in the middle. And in statistics, there is something called a standard deviation. And if you have a mean plus or minus one standard deviation, then 68% of the data should be within that limit, okay? And then if you're two standard deviations, 95% should be between the mean plus or minus two standard deviations. And if you go all the way to three standard deviations, then 99.7% of the data should be within that range. So here's where we're starting off. And so what I'm going to do here, if I can get it to change, there we go, is I've now shaded in the area of the mean plus or minus one standard deviation. Now, the mean is 55. The standard deviation for this particular data set is 11.1. So if you add and subtract that number from 55, you roughly get 44 to 66, and that would occur in a normal distribution 68% of the time. So now that may seem like a little bit of a big range, and I totally get where you're coming from there. So maybe we'd want to take a look at maybe 3/4 of a standard deviation or something like that. But the bottom line is, since we know the weather is different every year, instead of assigning a specific number and saying, yeah, that's what it should be, which is, quite frankly, to be blunt, stupid, why don't we say, if it's within this range, that's what you'd expect in this part of the country at this time of year. There's always going to be a little variance up and down. And then if you get outside of that range, then, it becomes a little bit more noteworthy. So now let's go plus or minus two standard deviations. And in this particular case, it takes up just about everything. And from a statistical standpoint, plus or minus 2 standard deviations is usually telling you that that data is going to occur 95% of the time, something within that range. So if the standard deviation is 11, 2 of those is about 22, and so the range then would be 33 to 77, which is just about the all-time range of 31 to 79. And if you go to 3 standard deviations, it actually goes out beyond the 31 and the 79. So that's why the bell curve doesn't have a nice smooth taper at the end there. It sort of, blocks off at the record high and the record low. But the whole point of this exercise is just to advocate for the idea that there is no number that is the typical high or low or average or anything else for any part of the country any time of year. Is that it makes more sense to say, let's take a look at generally what range these temperatures are in and call that a normal range as opposed to a normal high, a specific value. I think that would make a lot more sense. So I may play around with this, come up with some sort of a threshold and add it to the almanac page, and then, instead of saying, oh, the normal high is 55, but it was 54 today, which is below normal. Statistically, that's insignificant, okay? But if it's 44 or 34, then you can start talking to me about it, all right? So I hope that makes sense, and we'll see if I can add that to the almanac page at some point in time and see if you find it useful. That is the daily, or not the daily, it's the bonus weather video for this Friday. I hope you found that at least somewhat useful and interesting. Hope you have a wonderful Friday evening, an even better weekend, and enjoy all this nice weather coming up. And we'll be back on Monday and see if we are getting closer to some significant changes in our weather. So something to think about. So y'all take care, folks. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.